I'm Joan Bigham, and I'm one of the founders of AEGIS for Life, which is the alumni organization of AEGIS, of which all of you who are connected to AEGIS in any way are members. We will, if you haven't found us, we'll find you. And we like to say it's like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. We'll find you, and we want you to be part of this exciting organization. Just two quick things I'd like to offer before we begin. Number one, this is our second annual, which means officially it is annual. So this is now our annual tribute to Jack Mezirow lecture, and we're very excited about it. Yeah, great. So just a couple of quick words about AEGIS for Life. We have a mission. It's a two-part mission. One is to have a working network of all graduates and participants in AEGIS, faculty, students, whether they graduate or not. We want the whole community to be bound together, people who've made a lifetime commitment or lifelong commitment to adult learning and organizational learning, and we have that in common, and we're very excited about the community that we've formed. So you can support us by paying attention to our communication on LinkedIn, listening to Tej's communication on our listserv, and we also accept grants and contributions. We are sponsoring this along with the alumni, the Teachers College Alumni Office, and just a few quick thanks. We could not do this event without the help of Alejandra Mereb, who's probably in the hall. She does a fabulous job for us. And I also want to just shout out to Lyle Yorks and Victoria Marsick, who have become our selection committee, actually, for our speakers. And without their advice and guidance, we wouldn't have such great speakers. So thank you both for that. And then finally, I want to thank my co-chairman, Tej Anand, who's going to speak to you now. He and I have had a lot of fun doing this, and we intend to do it annually. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you all. It's so good to see you all. It just makes it so heartwarming to see everyone, to see the AEGIS community full of life. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Michel Aladev Jones. And before I tell you a little bit about him, I want you to know he is Swiss, and he is a dedicated father of 2 young kids. He also is the executive director of the Synchronous Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. He's a lecturer at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, and adjunct associate professor in adult learning and leadership at Teachers College, where he has been teaching since 2004, both the AEGIS cohorts as well as the adult leadership and learning program. He's been teaching them. And in fact, I'm proud to say that he taught me in the summer of 2009 with the biography course that AEGIS 226 has now started. So welcome AEGIS 26. And it was in that summer that we talked about the notion of time and space and transformation across time and space. And I remember it so fondly doing some of those exercises, visiting some of the neighborhoods in New York City, gathering memorabilia. And some of my team members who were with me doing that exercise are actually here in the audience, so that makes it even more special. So you guys are going to have a great time, and before taking any more time, I want to give you Michel. Thank you, Michel.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I also would like to thank very much the organizer of this event. I'm very, very pleased, and I feel very privileged to have this opportunity to have an hour of your time, or maybe a bit more, to discuss some of my current research interests. I don't know if we can have the PowerPoint. Thank you. So the title of my presentation is Temporal Complexity in Adult Life and Transformative Learning. And to some extent, as Tej just mention it. A lot of the reflection have been conducted, thank you, during the past 10 years approximately, have been fed by the work I've been doing here at Teachers College, including with AEGIS students. And actually, I'd like to just share with you one experience that I often mention when I talk about my work, because somewhere it symbolized a bit how this reflection emerged. It was in 2005 when Victoria Marsick suggested that I come to facilitate this life history course within the AEGIS program. And at that time, I used to work with Pierre Dominicet, who was professor at the University of Geneva, who developed this approach using life history in order to explore and research adult learning. And at that time, when I was co-facilitating those seminars with Pierre in Geneva, the class used to be organized around a period of 8 months, because at that time, academic semesters were organized on a much longer period than it is now. And so when I arrived in the US and I had to adapt the work I was doing, I've been asked to compress it in a time frame of approximately 3 weeks. So I had to go from the experience of learning about students, learning from students over a period of 8 months to a period of concentrated, some would say today, accelerated learning of 3 weeks. And actually this year, I'm happy to say that we're celebrating the compression of the program over a time period of 2 weeks for this very first period, which is a challenge because we keep the whole same process. So this experience triggered what I've retrospectively called a rhythmic dissonance. I was disturbed, maybe Jack Mezirow would call that a disorienting dilemma, between the experience of the timing of an educational process that I was used to from one time frame to another, obviously much shorter. So it's triggered a series of questions. How long is needed in order to learn something? How long is needed in order to build a feeling of trust with co-learner? How long is required for a process of exploration, of introspection around one's own life experience? How long does it require for people to be able to dive into that process, feel comfortable with it, and learn something significant from it? Those kind of questions were in my mind at that time, and since then have been in my reflection. Especially because for me, adult learning and the work we do in adult education is really about critical reflection, critical self-reflection, this capacity that we have individually and collectively to question our assumptions, to question the way we give meaning to our experience. And that process takes time. It's not something that we can just tweet about. It's something that needs to unfold, that needs to be exercised, and a bit like when we go to the gym, we have to warm up, it has to be also prepared. In the current period of the history we're living, finding this time for critical self-reflection is not something that we can take for granted. We are all competing with multiple demands, often conflicting, and therefore being able to find time to reflect on oneself, to slow down to some extent, to do so, is something that is challenging. I used to say, slowing down somewhere is a political act in itself. So, how to protect this time when people keep fighting with an increased pace of life? And again, some people call that in the academia accelerated learning, and there is research on that. Some call it also the McDonaldization of higher education, to say that there is also obviously critical voice about it. But for me, the problem is not just a matter of slowing down. There is also a trend you may be aware of in education, in school, around slow education, which defend the idea that it is precious and required indeed to slow down. However, even if I have obviously sympathy and I believe in the value of reflecting on the importance of slowness, I don't think that neither slowness nor speed have value in itself. It really depends on situation and context. In addition, another part of the problem is that, to some extent, I don't have to tell you about those things, because I'm pretty sure that most of you are experiencing what I'm talking about right now, this struggle we often feel or experience around multiple commitment. So it's not so much an issue of raising consciousness around urgency or the negative aspect of acceleration. I think the problem, and it's really one of the claims I'm defending in the book I'm going to talk about tonight, is the fact that we, to some extent, lack the language to talk about this experience. And the fact that we only have, to some extent, slowness versus speed as a way to qualify our experience of time is by itself self-explanatory about the problem that's raised by finding the right words, the right concept, the right nuances, because the idea is really how can we nuance the scope of experience that we have when we think about time. So to some extent, that's those kind of reflection were at the origin of the work I've been doing. And I'm sorry, that's a bit of the advertisement part of the presentation. Obviously, I mean, part of the context of this presentation has to do with the publishing of this book. I've been spending the last 3 years working on it, so it's also a way for me to share and try to also collect feedback and insight around this reflection. What I've done in this book is to try basically to explore 3 main questions, 3 main avenues. One, the first one is to think about what is the specificity of thinking about time in education. Physicists wrote about time, philosophers, obviously, biologists, social scientists, psychologists, every discipline in a way has something to say about time. And we in education have something to say about time because the temporalities that are involved in the act of learning, in the act of developing ourselves, in transforming ourselves and facilitating or fostering such processes, all that involves specific experience of time and unfold through time in a very specific manner. Therefore, I assume that there is a specificity to think and to conceptualize and to theorize those questions in education. And that's the first part of the book, was for me to try to argue about that. And I think one specificity that I'm going to try to develop a bit today with you is the fact that when we work in education, we're not just working with minds. We're not just working with bodies. We're not just working in physical environment. We're not just working in natural environment. We're working with all of that together. Therefore, we have to deal with a multiplicity of rhythms that are intertwined and that orchestrate to some extent what we do in education. Another path of reflection that I've tried to develop is to also try to understand how we get where we are today. And therefore, the second part of the book is more about a historical and social analysis of the evolution of the relationship between time and education. And I went pretty far away, building up on the work of historians and sociologists and anthropologists to try to reconstruct a narrative to describe the evolution of what I've called temporal constraint, and I'm going to develop this idea with you tonight. The fact that education is constrained by different forms of temporalities, at the same time that education itself constrains the way we experience time and envision what it is and what it means. And finally, the last part of the book is more specifically about the theme of emancipation, because for me, education, and not just adult education, but education more broadly, is about emancipation. It's about bringing people to find ways to develop, to increase their autonomy, their feeling of agency, their freedom, their margin of actions. And again, the process of emancipation is not just something that occurs overnight. It's something that unfolds through time. And so part of my reflection was about trying to find out how can we describe in a more fine-tuned way the temporalities involved in the process of emancipation. Now, what I'd like to share with you tonight is some of the key things that I've learned throughout this process, those past 10 years, And obviously, summarizing that in 45 minutes is by itself kind of a challenge. So I've tried to keep some of the key ideas in order to summarize and, again, confront that to your own experience, because I also would like to learn from you tonight. So I divided my presentation in 4 times. First, what is time and why does it matter? Second, how does time relate to learning and education? Third, how does the experience of time shape the way we evolve? And I'll refer there to transformative learning theory and the work of Jack Mezirow that we're also honoring tonight. And finally, how to interpret the experience of time in education, trying to open up a few reflections to enrich also your practice and your own experience as educator. What is time and why does it matter? The idea is really to bring you to step a bit aside and try to revisit what we take for granted when we think about time. Now, when you go to a bank and you talk with your banker and he talks to you about interest rate, about dividends, or when you go to the doctor and he talks to you about your level of cholesterol, the bad cholesterol and the good cholesterol, well, you have an idea what they are talking about. You can define more or less what it is about. Now, if you ask people, what is time? The most important aspect of our life, probably, because our days are counted here, it's much more difficult. And I'm sure that we are all struggling to some extent to define this notion. Philosophers have been struggling with it for 2,500 years, so I'm obviously not going to solve that question here tonight with you. And my goal now is not to have a philosophical or speculative approach about it tonight. What I would like to do is to provide you with some kind of element of definition so that it helps us think about our experience. 1700 years ago, Saint Augustine wrote, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain what it is, to him who asks, I do not know." So there is something with time that really escapes. We all know what is time to some extent. We feel it, we experience it. But defining it is really a challenge. And you'll find this quote in every single book about time, actually, because it's really part of the challenge of working on this issue. So let's try to deconstruct a bit our meaning or taken for granted assumption about time. When we think about time, what do we think about? What's the first thing that pops up in our mind? A clock. I'm Swiss, so maybe a cuckoo clock. So the clock is usually the first artifact that comes to our mind. Maybe not the one with the bird going out and doing some strange noise, but just the watch that you're wearing that we think about when we think about time. So what do clocks do? Well, the first thing they do is, to some extent, they refer to specific changes. When you look at your watch, what it does, it tells you, it symbolizes through the position of the hands or through number, if you have a digital watch, it symbolizes where the sun is in the sky. Or, if we want to be more accurate, what's the position of Earth around its own axis. So it says something about cosmological change, something that happened in the physical world we are living in and that we all share. Now, what happened when we look at our watch is that we are putting in relationship changes that occur on that device with changes that occur in the environment. So, first aspect of time, of this form of time, is that it establishes a relationship between changes. Now, we are not talking about any kind of changes. We are talking about changes that express some form of regularity. With the sun, it's about the alternance between day and night. And those changes, they don't occur randomly. They are coordinated. And again, in the case of the sun and the earth, they are coordinated by physical laws that influence, that define how celestial bodies revolve around themselves, and so on. So that's all what happened when you look at your watch. But the watch in itself doesn't say anything else, that just it symbolizes through its own changes that occur in environment. So the first claim that I would like to make, because my goal here is to expand this conception of time, the first claim I'd like to make is that whenever we observe changes that are coordinated and express some form of regularity, we may identify a specific form of temporality. And I didn't invent that definition. It comes from the work of historian Christopher Pomian, who wrote a very excellent book on time in history, actually. But the idea and the intent of this author was to try to find a way to define time in a way that allowed to grasp different expression of time. Because if there is one thing I'd like you to keep from this lecture tonight, is that time is not a singular thing. It's not just what clock display. Time is actually referred to a multiple form of changes and temporalities. And that's my second claim tonight. There is no single time, but many temporalities. So let's go a bit further and try to illustrate that. When you think about our natural environment, well, it has its own temporalities. Think about the seasons. The seasons that are also defined by the course of Earth around the sun and the fact that the rotation of the Earth is tilted, basically. Well, the changes that we observe every year, season after season, are following principles that are natural principles, physical and also biological when we observe nature. They display changes that follow some form of patterns that we recognize. Although today we could discuss about the fact that with current changes in the environment, this regularity is more disturbing to observe. Another form of natural temporality is the cycle of water. Again, changes that display some form of patterns that reoccur over time. Now, if we think about our own organism, we are a bundle of rhythm. We are a bundle of changes that occur every microseconds in the different organs of our body, and that occur according to specific rhythm. You can take any organ of our body, it is rhythm in a specific way. Our heart, obviously. If I take the same watch that gives me the position of the sun in the sky, and I look at the seconds and I take my pulse, it gives me another temporality. It gives me the temporality of my heart. Sleep. Maybe some of you are already in a specific stage right now of sleep. We go through the night through different phases that display some form of regularity that are genetically programmed. And they can obviously display variations, but nevertheless, they are there and we all share those aspects. So every organ, the brain, the heart, the digestion, if you just ate, you get into a specific stage of the development of how the body processes food. For women, there is also the cycle of menstruation that also displays some form of regularity and therefore express some form of temporalities that has impact on the body, on the mind, on the experience more broadly. Now, our mind itself has its own rhythms. Think about what chronopsychologists study, for example, the rhythm of attention. Well, depending on the time of the day, our body, our brain actually display capacity to process information in a more or less efficient way. Psychiatrists have also studied the temporality of the mind. For example, when you look at depression or people suffering from disorder of the mood, the alternance between manic depressive state is also something that expresses a regularity that displays some form of temporality. In relationship, we are also inscribe in pattern of behaviors that display some form of regularity and eventually reproduce themselves over time. Here I find, actually, as I was preparing that online, this cycle of abuse that I was not familiar with, but that describes some of the stage we go through in a relationship that is abusive. Now, let's look a bit more macro. Our society has its own temporalities. I give you two examples. Economists, they love to try to identify cycles so that we can figure out where we are in the evolution of how markets or financial aspects of our life are evolving. So there are many theories in economy about different cycle, different stage of the cycle we go through as a collectivity in the way market evolve. More close to us, the electoral cycle. Well, we just ended one, or a new one is just starting, depending on how we want to think about it, with different period, with the electoral period, the post-election period, the pre-electoral period, and so on. We need to move on. It's a cycle we go through every 4 years here in the US. And again, that influences the way we evolve, the way we live. We are all experiencing that right now. Now, if we think even about our artificial environment, what we are building, I'll take two examples to illustrate that. Computers. Well, try to take a computer which is 10 years old and watch a video just produced, and you'll suffer probably pretty much because the processor is unable to display correctly the pictures. So the speed, the way information is processed by computer has increased drastically, and to some extent it also influences the way we live. Same about communication, the way information not only is processed, but is transmitted. Here, a graph that I found online around the difference between 3G, 4G, and 5G network in the way information can be retrieved. So again, acceleration, would say some sociologists, a process of change that affect us in the way technology evolve. So physical temporalities, biological temporalities, psychological temporalities, social temporalities, artificial temporalities, which in this case are also physical. We are evolving in an environment made of different temporalities that are characterized by the way changes occur. Now, the next claim I would like to make from there, and I'm going to try to illustrate that with something closer to us, which is educational practice. But first, I would like to make another claim. The idea that any temporality is constraining. If you think about seasons, well, they obviously influence the way we dress, what we can do outside, inside, and so on. If we think about biological constraint, and if I bring that back in the classroom, we all know that there is time of the day where it's better not to teach, because it's either too early, too late, or just after a meal. And therefore, it's challenging because it has an effect on psychological processes, including attention. So again, our psychological processes are also constraining the way we can act collectively in the classroom, for instance. And social temporalities themselves are constraining. If I take back the example of AEGIS, the fact that we had to compress from 3 weeks to 2 weeks is mostly due to the fact that most of you are working and working in environments that are evolving in a way where today, more than probably before, it's challenging to find time to leave work and stay for a few weeks in an educational environment. So there are competing forces there between different temporalities, the temporalities of education versus the temporalities of work, for instance. Which brings me to my next claim. Struggling with time is the expression of attention between antagonistic temporalities. When we struggle with time, we are not struggling with that device. We are struggling with forces that we experience either from within, it can be our biological items, for instance, or age. It can be from outside. I'd like to borrow here a notion that I refer here to Gaston Pinault. Gaston Pinault, who is retired now, was a very significant thinker in the field of adult education in France. He's among the first one to have written about, if not the first one, to have written about time in adult education and from a lifelong learning perspective. Pinault defined a notion that I found very intriguing, called it schizochrony. Schizo from the Greek, which is divided, like schizophrenia. Schizochrony, chrony from chronos, time. So that refers to the fact that we are experiencing a feeling of being split between different temporalities. So that's one form of struggle that we may be experiencing. And the most probably simple example is the challenges that some of us experience between family time and work time, for instance. Now, I mentioned earlier this idea of rhythmic dissonance. That's another form of struggle between the experience of rhythm, for instance, as they are experienced in different cultures. One notion that I develop in my book is the notion of temporal double bind. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of double bind that was formulated by Gregory Bateson in the mid-50s or 60s. This idea that we are often suffering from mixed messages that lock us in situations where whatever we do wrong. And from a temporal perspective, people who work in education, for example in school, may experience this time of situation, double bind. I call them temporal double bind because they refer to the way we experience time. For instance, one thing that characterized school throughout the 20th century is the idea that teachers have to be efficient. That's actually quite a recent invention. It comes from, it's a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, basically. This idea that the actions that are implemented in the classroom have to be rationalized and a bit like the tailorization of work, have to be temporally efficient. But at the same time, we are not, although we could question sometimes, but we are not on an assembly line when we are in the classroom. We are also there to respect the singularity of every learner. And there is a whole value in education, again, which is relatively recent, about taking into consideration and respecting the rhythms, cognitive, emotional, developmental, that characterize the pupils. But if you want to do both, being efficient, rational in the use of the time, and at the same time respect every learner's own rhythm, you can do that. So if you are forced to do that, you are put in a position where you can literally have the feeling to become crazy. So obviously, there is strategies that we develop in order to accommodate, but those strategies can never be taken for granted. So, as individuals, as members of collectivities, we are all facing those dilemmas, those tensions between multiple temporalities. We are evolving in this. I'd like to illustrate that a bit from my own experience. And to go back to some of the things I've said, we all ideally would like to privilege family time. I have 2 young kids, Tej mentioned it earlier, and I have to say that from a temporal perspective, my life has drastically evolved during the last 5 years because kids have their own rhythm, and you cannot really mess up with their rhythm because it's really about their own development, and you have to accommodate to it. So family time, one constraint, one source of constraint. Then there are friends. You know, ideally, I'd like to be able to find time to sustain friendship. Friendship is something that is not just happening like that. It's something that's sustained over time and therefore needs to be protected when there's so many other things going on. Then there is culture. I like to go to museum. I like to travel. So that takes time too. And the temporalities of cultural life have their own logic. And then there is work. So you have to go walk, obviously, and work involves, AEGIS people who have their own rhythm, and that, again, is constrained to some extent, as I mentioned it earlier. And then sometimes you'd like to do something. You're going to write for the newcomers at AEGIS a dissertation. Finding time to write, that's something quite critical. You have to protect that because the temporality of writing has its own logic, and it's not the same logic as work, as parenting, or even as being in a classroom. So that's something you are going to learn. And that may be one of the most significant learning you may do, actually, is to be able to organize yourself in a way to protect that specific time. Now, all that, I'm very privileged. I can say I've had the possibility to choose most of what's going on in my life, and I'm aware of those privileges. There is also all what's going on here. There's the time for yourself. That's another temporality, try to save time, to be on your own sometimes. But then for those of you who go to work, there is transportation, those constraints that you have to move from one place to another, and that follow our own logic and sometimes prevent you to do anything relevant in a day. And then there is administrative temporalities that add up. And then more work, more things that you didn't plan to do. And those things kind of pollute, to some extent, the rhythm that we would like to protect. Did I mention emails? Okay, that's another one, communication, instant communication. I didn't mention social network because I have the luck not to be on it, but that's another thing that obviously pollutes our life. So, fifth claim I would like to make with you, living through or with heterogeneous temporalities is a matter of synchronization. Synchronization comes from the ancient Greek word synchronos, which is also the name that I give to the institute I'm directing in Geneva. Synchronos, which means literally sun, which means together, chronos, time, that goes at the same time, that goes in time together. So the idea of synchronization is the idea that it refers to the phenomenon of bringing rhythm to follow the same pace. And that's a notion that has been used mostly in biology to refer to the capacity of the body to synchronize multiple rhythms together. We can use the metaphor here of the orchestra, the capacity to bring different instruments to play at the same time. So I'd like here to use a picture that I took a few years ago and that I think illustrates pretty well multiple temporalities that we are living through and how they keep us in touch. It was during the first election of President Obama, and I was with my wife that day on Times Square. And I like this picture because you find in it a lot of the different temporalities that we're experiencing in social life, but also that I think illustrate the way we, as human beings, synchronize with each other. The day of the election is a time where we get in sync, socially speaking, because we are all casting our vote, our voice, our political opinion at the same time to elect someone. On this picture, you can see on the billboard sport, there is a basketball game. Well, each sport has its own temporality, and that requires players to get in sync with each other according to specific rules and play those rules. And time is usually a part of the strategy we play in sport. There is the temporality of information in the news that also get us in sync, and so on. So every society relies on institutions that synchronize people's activities so that they can live and evolve together. Sometimes significant events play that role and serve as a synchronizer within a collectivity. Here in the US, I'm sure that most of you remember, and also beyond the US, where you were on September 11, 2001, because that was an event, traumatizing, that marked us and to some extent became historical because it synchronized a society or even the world to some extent around a specific event. So synchronization is critical in the way we live. Now, sixth claim, synchronization is a matter of power dynamic. Think about the classroom. As a teacher, or as a facilitator, you have to synchronize a lot of different elements. The content that you have to transmit or develop, the people, the group dynamics that's going on, the setting, the rules, the calendar that are imposed on us by the institution. And sometimes it's challenging. So the question is raised then, when synchronicity, when the capacity to synchronize people together is difficult and cannot be taken for granted, what and who do we privilege? The idea is that when you're in a position to have to synchronize people, to decide what you are going to prioritize, you exercise a form of power. And therefore, the experience of time is a locus of power dynamics. Okay, I'm going to go a bit faster on the second part because I'm actually aware of the time and I'm far beyond what I was planning. So how does time relate to learning and education? Basically, there is really three ideas that I would like to develop here. The first one is that learning is always inscribed in a temporal environment. I mentioned it, institution, if you take family, work, or formal education, they have their own conception of time. And therefore shape and constrain the way we learn in those different institutions. That's through the way they're organized that it appears. They're also involving people, I mentioned that, who have different way of processing information, of learning. All those elements have their own temporalities, and therefore when we think about time in education, we have to think about how we pilot, how we synchronize those different elements. Now, as another way to think about the relationship between learning and time is about the process of learning itself. Learning always occurs through specific temporal dynamics. If you think about learning a language, if I want today to learn Chinese or Italian, it's going to take time. It's not something I'm going to be able to compress. So knowledge, skills have their own requirements in terms of temporality. Learning about each other. If you think about a significant other, well, we learn every day about each other in a relationship that has its own temporality also. It's not something you can necessarily accelerate. Society itself learns through its own history. So there is different way to conceive the process of learning and their temporality. The next claim I would like to make here is that the experience of time in itself may constitute a formative source of learning. And I'm really advocating for that now. The idea that reflecting on the way we experience time, for example, temporal conflict that I've mentioned earlier, rhythmic dissonance, schizophrenia, temporal double bind, those things, when you start reflecting on those experiences, they may teach you something about the world we are living in, about how we work, how we process, how we live with each other. When, in the framework of AEGIS, we work on life history, we take distance in order to think about the temporality of our life and how we make sense and give meaning to it. So reflection around existential time in itself is a source, potentially, of learning. So that's three ways to think about this connection, the connection between time and education. So I believe that as educator, we need to know how to relate to those different aspects. Because if we don't critically position ourselves, then we are just passively, actually, experiencing how society, how individuals impose on us or impose on a setting specific rhythm. So let's go a bit further in the reflection. How does the experience of time shape the way we evolve? I would like here to connect more specifically with transformative learning theory. And I would like to discuss the claim according to which I believe education, including self-development, is a rhythmic process. When you think about transformative learning, and for those who just started AEGIS, that's something you're going to hear probably a fair amount of time because it's at the core of the program, Mezirow's theory on transformative learning. One aspect of Mezirow's theory is that transformation in adulthood occurs around the experience of specific discontinuities, experiences that interrupt the continuity of our life. And Mezirow calls that disorienting dilemmas. Disorienting dilemmas are experiences that trigger the need to question ourselves and to question the environment in which we are in order to revisit how we interpret our experience and eventually transform ourselves or transform the environment in which we evolve. The experience of crisis is an experience of sometimes trigger disorienting dilemma. Another way to mention that is epiphanies, this revelation that sometimes we have when we wake up. Oh, my goodness, why am I still working in this company? I need to leave. I need to leave now. That's an example of sudden change that may bring some kind of disruption and trigger a transformative process. In French, we use the word also épreuve, ordeal, that refer to situations that test us, test our capacity to handle unexpected events or situations that test our resources and that we don't necessarily know how they are going to unfold. Therefore, they are uncertain. And because there is uncertainty, there is room for self-reflection and questioning of the situation. So that's one way to conceive transformation. Another way is to conceive it as an ongoing and continuous process. If I refer again to Mezirow's theory, Mezirow put the stress on the importance of dialogue and self-reflection. Those two processes, they don't occur just like that. They are not punctual in one's life. They're something that we need to sustain. Dialoguing is more than just expressing oneself. It's about capacity to listen to the other, to understand the meaning of each other. And that takes time to be able to set up and to experience. Self-reflection, critical self-reflection also is a process that takes time to be experienced. Therefore, typically those two processes unfold through time and they are to some extent continuous. There is a French philosopher, François Julien, who talked about silencious transformation to refer to those changes that occur in our life, in the background of our life, that we are not really aware of. And then one day we wake up and we see we have gray hair, a lot of gray hair actually, and we're aging. But every day, every second we are aging, obviously. It's a silencious process of transformation that occur through incremental changes. Now, I would like to go further in this reflection around discontinuities and continuities and the way we conceive the work of transforming ourselves or contributing to the transformation of others. What are the images that we use to conceive the ideal type of transformation? When you think about transformation, what do you think about? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Yeah? A flower blooming? Yes. Others? Other butterfly? Yes. Someone the other day told me also the chicken and the egg. It's one I'd never thought about. I'll take the example of the butterfly. I'd like to briefly show you a very short video. And I'm going to just show you an extract, something I found online. I'd like you to pay very attention of the detail of what you see. And that's not in slow motion, that's real time. So this part of the transformation, as you can see, is slow, and it takes some kind of effort. It's almost boring to some extent to watch it, and I wanted to show a significant part of the video, especially now. I like what's going on right now. If you look at some of the movement that are going on in the abdomen, you can feel that things are kind of getting in position. And then the antenna. So there is a second video, because before to get to that stage, actually the butterfly, well, obviously comes from the caterpillar. The caterpillar has to transform into a chrysalis, and what we just saw was the transformation from the chrysalis to the butterfly. Now, what went before is that. That's when the caterpillar that is hooked through a silk thread is going to transform itself into the chrysalis. I'm not going to show you the last 3 minutes. I'm not going to show everything because we're a bit late. But what I'd like you to pay attention to is the movement that's going on. Here it's a bit accelerated, because if it was not, we probably would not be able to perceive it. So the process of transformation from one state to another go to this kind of rhythmic pattern of change that occurs in the body of the caterpillar that eventually lead it to become a steady chrysalis that's going to stay for, I don't remember if it's 1 or 2 weeks, until the eclosion of the butterfly. So it's a very repetitive process that's going on. And here again, I'm not going to show you everything here. But what I'd like you to keep from this video is the idea that most changes that occur in the background of transformation are invisible. And they are mostly rhythmic, meaning that they're repeating themselves. They are patterns of change that display some form of regularity. Therefore, they have their own temporality, if you remember the definition I was bringing in the very beginning. So the idea here that I would like to, I'm going to turn that off because you're not going to be distracted. Here we go. The idea that I would like to move on with, and actually I'm going to accelerate a bit so that make sure that we have enough time for questions and discussion, is that everyone experiences transformative learning and emancipation at one's own pace. So you'll find, and maybe among you some are familiar with developmental theories that claim that the way we develop ourselves follows specific stages that are, either cognitive stage of development, emotional, moral. There's different theories that define and describe how humans develop themselves through kind of order of a sequence of stages. I'm not criticizing necessarily those frameworks here, but what I would like to say is that based on my experience working on life history, what I see is that in parallel of those stages that we may or may not observe in real life, there is the rhythmicity of how people change themselves, transform themselves through the repetition of patterns that can be way of thinking, patterns that can display way of relating with each other, way of speaking, way of moving, and so on. So we transform ourselves through not only discontinuities, not only events that are disrupting our everyday life, but also through those things that we keep repeating. And two examples I would briefly give. One is traveling. It's always striking to me to see in narrative the role of traveling in people's life. Sometimes one travel is enough to change, to bring significant change in one's life, but often it goes through the repetition of traveling in different places and doesn't have to be necessarily very far. So there is a pattern of moving geographically from one place to another that is repeated, therefore displays some form of regularity. So there is a temporality of traveling, and that temporality is part also of how we develop ourselves. I was going to give you another example, but I'm going to pass on it. I wanted to talk about pregnancy. I was going to talk a bit about my experience, my family experience of pregnancy, because pregnancy is a process that is genetically framed. So in a way, we all know how long does it take for a baby to grow and come to life. But at the same time, it's a process that can be experienced as transformative, but is also always experienced in a very singular way, depending of the mother, depending of the family context, depending of the cultural environment, and the time of history when it occurred. We'll talk maybe about that later in the Q&A. But what I would like to say, my main point here is really this idea that I encourage you to think about the way yourself have evolved or still evolve in your life, and how it displays patterns of thinking, of behaving, of relating, of moving. And those patterns, they display, because they display some form of regularity, they have their own temporality. Therefore, what's at the core of our work as adult educator is to find a way to help or bring people to become aware of the very specific temporality through which they've developed themselves, so that we can foster, again, a capacity to reflect on whether it's a productive or constructive or emancipatory way of evolving, or whether it displays a situation where we feel stuck in the repetition of patterns that prevent us actually to move on. So I'm going to move on the pregnancy part. But the key question here is, how do we learn to find and assert the rhythms that are appropriate for ourselves? I do believe, and I'm going to slowly conclude on that point, that this capacity, that it requires a specific form of intelligence, we could say, intelligence understood here as a capacity to adapt or adjust ourselves. We could call it a rhythmic intelligence, but what's important is not the way we call it, it's what it means. The capacity to recognize how we evolve through time in our own singular way, and how it relates to the multiple rhythms that make the fabric of one's own life. The very last thing I would like to say, to give you an opening of how to think about those rhythms that constitute the way we develop ourselves. Referring to the last part of what I wanted to present, how to interpret the experience of time in education. I subtitled it, Envisioning a Rhythm Analytical Perspective. Here it's an allusion to two French philosophers, Gaston Bachelard and Henri Lefebvre, who have played with this idea of rhythm analysis as a capacity that people have to develop ability to discriminate the rhythms of our life. So my assumptions here, and that's actually probably the topic of my next book, is that as professional in education and beyond education, there is something to get from developing this capacity to be very sensible to the rhythms that constitute the singularity of how people work, live, and evolve in the multiple aspects of their life. So I do believe that learning to analyze rhythm is a critical skill that can be developed, and there is everything to invent here, because the few people who wrote about that let the field quite open about what is required in order to develop this capacity. The last thing I would like to present to you today, and it's short, and in a way it's a way for me to sum up some of the things I've said earlier, is how to think about this rhythmic dimension that is constitutive of the experience of time. And I borrow here three notions that have been conceptualized and theorized by a French philosopher contemporary, Pierre Sauvanet, who extensively worked on this idea of rhythm, as three aspects that we must pay attention to. And to explain it, I refer to a painting that he used in his book, painting from Paul Klee, painter from the early 20th century, that is called Rhythmics. The first aspect, there is three aspects. First aspect of rhythm, I mentioned it a lot tonight, patterns. Patterns provide a rhythm with a specific organization, a structure, or a configuration. Second aspect, repetition. Repetition of a pattern involves a period, a frequency, or a pace that define the rate of occurrence. So if I take the painting next there, the pattern is quite easy to identify. It's a succession of square-like shape that are black, gray, white. There is a pattern there, black, gray, white, then black, gray, white again. And it's reproduced. So there is a periodicity because there is a repetition of a pattern of black, gray, white. Now, the repetitions are rarely repetition of the exact same phenomenon, but rather the recurrence of something similar. Sorry. So rhythms display what Sauvanet called a movement. If you think at this shape, not every single square-like shape is the same than the other. Not every pattern of black, gray, white is the same of the previous one. And actually, you can even see that sometimes the pattern is broken, the color are interverted. So when we think about the experience of time, we experience rhythmic changes that occur in a rhythmic way. And those changes, we can identify them because they display some patterns, because they repeat themselves according to some specific periodicity, and because as they unfold in our life, they are part of a movement that is never exactly the repetition of the same thing. So I'm going to end up there, and maybe in the discussion we'll be able to go further with some of those ideas. That's what you heard tonight, 14 claims that are part of the way I think we should think about time in education. And for those of you who are interested, please keep in touch with me. I would love to hear your questions. I recently started a blog called Autoethnography of a Rhythm Analyst, where I use my own experience as a researcher, as a trainer, to reflect on what goes into the work of rhythm analysis. And I would like to eventually create a vlog, a video blog, where I would be eventually responding to some questions that people may have around those topics. So if you feel like it, contact me, and maybe one way to start the movement. Thank you very much for your attention.